familiar faces from last week, which means one of two things. Either I didn't bore you enough, you're coming back for seconds, or you didn't know I was coming. So surprise. So in order to avoid some of the technical issues that we had last week, I'm just going to get it going and then leave it, and then do something which I didn't do last week, which is give you a little bit more of an introduction as to who I am. So that's good. So my name's Wesley. A lot of you know me, but a lot of you don't. So I just thought I'd give you a little bit of background as to who I am. I grew up a missionary kid. I was born in Multan, Pakistan, where my parents were working. And a short time after I was born, the U.S. launched Operation Desert Storm, which in turn launched the Gulf War. So I don't know if you know this, but raising kids in a war zone is not a great idea. So my parents left, and we came back to Canada for a short stint, before my parents eventually got visas to go back to the area, to Amman, Jordan, where my parents were doing missionary work and where I spent a good portion of my childhood. When we came back to Canada, just before my 12th birthday, I actually I got a degenerative nerve condition, which actually left me paralyzed from the waist down, and was a paraplegic, and was told I was going to be a paraplegic for the rest of my life. Well, God did a miracle, and the medical professionals did call it a miracle. So I had that very profound moment in my life, that experiential thing that happened to me, and yet still in my late teens, I went through a searching period. I went through a period where I knew what my parents believed, and I knew what I sort of believed, but I figured that if I believed what my parents believed, just for the sake of it, that wasn't really a great reason to believe it. So I grew up in a household where we were lucky to have some of these other worldview perspectives on the shelf. Growing up in the Middle East, I was well acquainted with things like Quranic literature and the Islamic history, which was just in my dad's office. So I went through the searching period where I evaluated these other worldviews. Over the course of about a year and a half, I have a thing on my computer that makes it dimmer so that it doesn't affect me when I sleep when I pop on my computer. What was I saying? I went through this period of searching where I read the Quran cover to cover for the first time. I read a good chunk of the Mormon literature, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants of the Prologue of Christ, and the histories of the church. I read the New World Translation, which was the Jehovah's Witnesses translation. I read the Gitas, which is the Hindu scriptures, and the Sutras, which are the Buddhist holy writings. And as I evaluated all of these writings and I put them on the same standard as the Bible, I kept seeing a pattern. All of these other perspectives, all of these other holy books, sort of fell by the wayside. They weren't historically accurate. They weren't logically consistent. They weren't experientially relevant. And so, as those fell away, the Bible kept coming up on top. And that's where I really sort of made my faith my own and came to that perspective. And I didn't know it at the time, but what I was doing was apologetics. I was evaluating the questions that I had concerning my faith. And I went to high school in a small northern Ontario town, and because I did all that, I didn't actually get an opportunity to put it into practice until I got to university. I went to York University, and all of a sudden, there were Muslims. And there were all of these other worldviews, atheists, skeptics. I didn't even have to go out and find the Mormons, they found me. And when they didn't, I got to the car and found them. And so I sort of developed this nurturing perspective to defending the faith, to evangelizing to others, and what turned into my love of apologetics. So I'm back to talk about a completely different issue, but first, what I have to do is I have to clear something up, because last week I gave the example, when we were talking about textual in the Bible, I gave this example of John 5:4, the quote-unquote missing verse in the Bible. It's not there. It goes John 5:3, John 5:5. And I got someone to look for it, I couldn't find it, and I told you that was a textual variant, and I was going to explain why it was, and then I never did. So I know you've been waiting around all week wondering, John 5:4, why isn't that in the Bible? So it's what actually we call a scribal marginal explanatory note. That's a mouthful. So what does that mean? Well, what happened was a scribe in the 4th century was copying down the Bible. And he came to John chapter 5, which is the story of Jesus healing the lame man at the pool of Bethsaida. And he came to that section where it talks about Bethsaida, and he just sort of mentions it in passing, but it doesn't explain what it was. So what a scribe did is in the margin, he explained what it was. And it's not in the modern translations of the Bible. It is in brackets in the NASB, and it's found in the King James Version. But what he wrote was, to explain what it was, for an angel of the Lord went down at a certain season into the pool and stirred up the water. Moreover, then at first, after the stirring up of the water, stepped in, was made well from whatever disease with which he was affected. I don't know if I read it right. You can read it. So what it was, it explained what the pool of Bethsaida was. Well, that scribe died, and a few decades later, another scribe was copying his manuscript. And he came to this section, and he didn't know whether that was a verse that was meant to be put into the Bible, that it actually was part of the biblical message of John, and he just forgot to put it in, and so he wrote it in the margin, or whether it was an explanatory note. So, to be safe, he included it in the text. And he couldn't ask the scribe who wrote it, because the scribe had been dead for a long time. But what happened was that manuscript proved to be very important, and after that, that was copied into the text and made its way into the majority of manuscripts. But because we have this plethora of manuscripts that I explained last week, we know that it's not original. We know that John didn't write it. And as an example, I gave you that manuscript there on the left is a very important manuscript called Codex Sinaiticus, and you can see all of these marginal notes that are written in. It's a very common practice. Well, today what I'm going to talk about are what I'm calling contenders. I'm going to talk about the books that were written in and around the time of Jesus that didn't make their way into the Bible. The books that didn't make it. Well, first I'm going to show you a little video.
It's when I went hitchhiking as a teenager that I first read the New Testament. In the back. On that occasion, the driver who picked me up was a Christian, and we got talking. He said if I wanted to find out about God, I should read the Gospels.
I wasn't travelling through the Egyptian desert at the time. I was actually on my way down to Exeter, hitching along the A303. But there was a turning point. And when I got home, I read the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I think really it was John that struck a chord with me, with its deep sense of Christian mystery, and its poetry, and its mysticism.
That day was the first step on a journey that led to my ordination as a priest in the Church of England. But what I didn't know then was that these Gospels were only a fraction of the information we have about Jesus. In fact, over the last century, discoveries here in the Egyptian texts have revealed that in the first 400 years after Jesus' death, there were in existence more than 20 Gospels, 15 apocalypses, and nearly 50 other texts about Jesus. So why do we only know of the ones in the New Testament? This is the story of a battle of words that spread across continents, that led to intrigue, forgery, condemnation. A battle in which texts fought against each other for acceptance in a fledgling faith. And what was at stake was the kind of faith that Christianity would turn out to be.
If the Gospel of Peter had won out, Christians today might believe that Jesus never died. If the Gospel of Philip had won, Mary Magdalene might be hailed as the first. If the infancy narrative of James had been accepted, I would have learned in Sunday school that a child called Jesus caused his teacher to wither on the spot just for reprimanding him and class. In fact, if any of the different texts that ended up in the New Testament, Christianity today was very different, or perhaps it was survive.
I got very quiet again. That's just for dramatic effect. Well, what do you do with that? What do you do when those kinds of objections are made regarding the Bible? Well, it seems that if you're looking for ways to critique Scripture, there are seemingly endless options these days. There are historical critiques. Jesus was never a historical character that existed. There are logical critiques, such as the contradictions in the Gospels. There are moral critiques, such as, God, the God of the Old Testament is a moral monster to command that cities be destroyed and people be slaughtered. And there are interpretative techniques that of, this group has one interpretation of the text and this group has one interpretation of the text. And because they can't agree, well, we can't possibly know what the original text said. Well, all of those critiques have their place, and I think we need to address those. But they're all essentially the same. They argue that the words of the Bible are not true. But my field of study, textual biblical criticism, I believe addresses not those internal critiques, but external critiques, which I believe to be more foundational, and a more foundational challenge, because it not only raises the objection that it doesn't matter if the words of the Bible are true, but it poses the critique that we don't even have the words of the Bible to begin with. Last week, we looked at that in terms of the radical skeptical view concerning the textual variants, that all we have are copies of copies of copies and translations of translations of translations, and they're all full of errors. And you can't possibly know what the original said. Well, what I want to look at this week are the books themselves. In particular, why we have the books we do when we open our Bibles. Why them and not others? Now, you may have not even thought about this question. It may not even occurred to you. Because if you go to a Christian bookstore and you pick up a Bible, it's going to have the same 27 books in the New Testament. No matter if you buy it in Barrie or in Toronto or in Budapest. And they're all going to be in the same order and in the same sequence. So how do we deal with this issue? Well, before I go directly into the issue, what I need to do is I need to pinpoint two very important dates and places in history. The first is 1934 in Germany. 1934 was a big year for Germany. It was actually the year that Adolf Hitler, became the Führer and the head of the German nation and the Nazi Party. And it wasn't too long after that Germany invaded Poland and started World War II. But 1934 was a big year for Germany for another reason. Very quietly, behind the scenes, a man named Walter Bauer, a biblical scholar, published a monograph that would eventually change the landscape of biblical studies to come. He wrote a book called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity. Now, compared to Adolf Hitler's rise, the book didn't really make all that much of a wave. However, in 1971, it was translated into English. And because of that, and because it was opened up, the book itself changed biblical studies in the English-speaking world. Well, what Bauer's book was about is he hypothesized what's called the Bauer thesis. So what is the Bauer thesis? Well, Bauer argued that early Christianity was a bit of a mess, a theological quagmire, if you will. That you had all these different groups claiming to be Christians. They were all fighting and competing, claiming to have the accurate picture of what Christianity and what Jesus was really like. No one could agree about who Jesus was and what he taught and how to be saved and what God was like. More or less, what Bauer argued for was diversity. He argued that because we have such a diverse range of beliefs and writings in that early period, sort of what was outlined in that beginning clip of the BBC documentary, we can't possibly know what early Christianity looked like to begin with. And Bauer said that all of these books have credibility, all of them have credence, and the books that we have in the New Testament are just the books of the theological winners. Now, Bauer's thesis has been roundly refuted by scholars for centuries, but this idea, what's called the theory of Christianities, that there are more than one Christianity, and they all have these books, has made a resurgence as of late. There are a number of scholars, I talked about one last week, Bart Ehrman, who are really pushing this idea. We have others like Elaine Pagels and Massey Hall. We have these authors who are propagating this idea once again. I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are lots of ways to critique Christianity, what those external critiques are. However, what we're seeing now is that people are saying, I want a new version of Christianity. And the way they're going about that is by actually challenging the books of the Bible. Case in point, Da Vinci Code. The Da Vinci Code made so much of a wave because it was promoting this idea that there were all these books and that somehow at the Council of Nicaea there was a vote. Now there was no vote. The Council of Nicaea had nothing to do with the books of the Bible. And I also mentioned last week this quotation from Ariel Sabar from the Atlantic, who just last month wrote that after Constantine converted the Roman Empire, which I mentioned didn't happen, to Christianity in the 4th century, and church leaders began canonizing the small selection of texts that formed the New Testament, Christians with other views were branded heretics. This is propagating the Bauer thesis, the Christianities thesis. So before I start, I need to just outline some words for you. I'm going to be using these words like apocryphal. Now, when I use the word apocryphal, what I'm not talking about is the apocrypha, which are the list of list of books in the Catholic Bible. The Catholic Bible has more books, but that has nothing to do with the New Testament and the apocryphal literature. If you want to ask me about that afterwards, I'd be more than willing to talk about it, but for time reason, I'm not going to. The other word I'm going to be using is canon. Now, what you need to remember is canon with two ends goes boom. Canon with one end means a rule or list. It's a Greek word that just means measuring rod. It literally means a measuring stick. And so when we talk about the canon, probably a word you've heard before, we're talking about the authoritative list of documents. Likewise, the apocryphal comes from the Greek word apokryphos, which means obscure, and that's just referring to all of these books, all of this range of literature that didn't make it into the Bible. So I talked about Bauer and Germany. The second date that I want you to keep in mind is 1945 in Egypt. Now, in 1945 in Egypt, a man named Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, in 1945 the boxer wasn't doing much in Egypt, he wasn't doing much at all in 1945. Muhammad Ali was a shepherd and a farmer. He was out in the Egyptian desert with his brother, Yusuf Ali, and they were digging for essentially fertilizer. Well, their shovels hit something hard, and what they dug up was a 4-foot-high clay jar. Well, Yusuf Ali, Muhammad's brother, actually said, don't open it, there might be a genie who will curse us. True story. In fact, in Islamic theology, the idea of genies, or what they call jinns, these spirits, is pretty common. We've just adapted that into our Western idea of a genie. Well, they weighed the pros and cons, and they thought there might be a genie, but there also might be gold in it. And that might be worth breaking it open. So they broke it open, and to their dismay, all they found were manuscripts, books, codices. And among that was this book. This is what's known as the Gospel of Thomas. And this find really pushed ahead the Bauer thesis, the idea that there were all of these books. Now, they knew about some of them in 1935 in the days of Bauer, but only roughly 10 years later, we have these books being found, being dug up in the sands of Egypt. Well, just like the previous story, this story, it didn't make much of a wave. In 1945, again in Nazi Germany, World War II had just ended. And many things were happening in Europe and in the Pacific Theater, and not many people were paying attention to a shepherd in the backwaters of Egypt. However, these books, when they actually got into the hands of a curator, they made waves. And this is part of a collection that we now refer to as the Nag Hammadi Library. It was founded in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Well, My question today is, did or do these books have a shot at being in the biblical canon? And I'm going to approach it in two ways. I'm going to look at a general response and talk about the general ways that this idea is sort of exaggerated, and then I'm going to look at a specific response, and we're going to jump into some of the books in particular. Well, this idea is propagated by the fact that a lot of the early Christians were utilizing, and quoting these other books, and we know that for a fact. But what I'm going to try to prove is that mere use does not prove authoritative status. Now, here's a quote from a man named Jeffrey Hanneman, who's a New Testament scholar. He says, Christian writers of the 2nd century refer to many other gospels besides the canonical 4. And he's absolutely right. They did. These early Christians were using these books, and they were quoting them. Now, I'm telling you this so that you don't get blindsided by these sort of Da Vinci Code-esque arguments. The early Christians were using these books. The problem and the question is not whether that fact is true, it's what conclusion you draw from that fact. Well, Hanneman draws this conclusion. This would seem unlikely if the fourfold gospel canon had already been established. Well, I think Hanneman is soundly wrong, and how I'm going to prove that is by quoting some of the early Christians. Well, here we have a guy, Irenaeus, who lived in the latter half of the 2nd century, the beginning of the 3rd century. And he says this in his work Against Heresies: but it is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are. For since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live, and 4 principal winds, and the cherubim too were 4-faced. Now this sounds like kind of a weird argument to the modern ear. You know, there are only 4 Gospels because the cherubim had 4 faces. How does that work? Well, in the 1st century, this wouldn't have sounded as weird as it does now. The idea of numbers, and you see this in the Bible with numbers like 40 and 12, they were a big thing. Not necessarily numerology, where we make a bigger deal of those numbers than are due, but the fact that Irenaeus is playing on these patterns in the Bible. Well, what Gospels does Irenaeus name? He says there are only 4. Well, what are those 4? Well, they're Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's no debate about that. Another guy, contemporary of Irenaeus, Theophilus. Now, Theophilus is a nickname. It actually means friend of God. The author of the Gospel of Luke and Acts, same guy. Actually, those books are written to a guy named Theophilus. If you look at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke and then the beginning of Acts. Theophilus, that's not this Theophilus. This is a completely different Theophilus. He says, concerning the righteousness which the law enjoined, confirmatory utterances are found both with the prophets and in the Gospels, because they all spoke inspired by one Spirit of God. What's he saying? Well, he's saying that the Old Testament prophets spoke in the same way and with the same spirit as the Gospel authors. Well, what ones does he name? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Thomas. Just kidding, John. In fact, that's an interesting fact. We have a lot of these lists. Not once do we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Thomas. Not once. Or Matthew, Peter, Luke, and John. It's always, whenever we see these lists, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, Irenaeus and Theophilus are good examples, but they're not the only ones. We have other writers. A very important early Christian named Clement of Alexandria, before Irenaeus and Theophilus, he likewise said there are only 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So did a guy named Tatian and a guy named Origen. Origen wrote quite a bit of literature, and in that he says there are only 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then we have a very important writing called the Muratorian Fragment, or the Muratorian Canon, which is written in the middle to the latter half of the 2nd century. And it goes through a whole range of all the reasons why there are only a certain number of books in the New Testament, and it names the majority of the books in the New Testament. And guess what? It says Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You're going to get really sick of me saying that. Well, there's another way we can test this. We can look at their quotations. How many times do they quote the 4 Gospels as opposed to some of these other books? Well, let's look at Clement of Alexandria. He quotes the Gospel of Matthew 700 times. Okay, well, how often does he quote the whole range of apocryphal literature? Not just one book, but the whole range. Well, 16 times. That's a pretty big difference. Now, mere use does not equate reception, but it's interesting to look at that sort of example. What's the second general response that I want to give? Well, I'm going to look at something that I touched on last week, the biblical manuscripts. How many of these biblical manuscripts do we have? How do we know how popular a book was in the ancient world? Well, there's two ways. We can look at how people at that time viewed them and how they used them, which is sort of what I touched on when I showed you the quotations of Clement. But the other way we can do it is we can do an examination of the extant remains of manuscripts. So how many biblical manuscripts do we have? And I'm just going to look at the 2nd and the 3rd centuries. We have 60 manuscripts in whole or in part, just in the 2nd and 3rd century. Now, for those of you that are here last week, you'll remember the fact that for the vast majority of contemporaneous writings within antiquity, that never happens. I mean, we don't get writings of Plato till hundreds of years. I gave you the example of Xenophon. We're waiting 1,800 years. By the way, if some of you are thinking about having kids, I'm using some great names. So if you want to, I mean, you thought it was good last week with Herodotus and Xenophon. Irenaeus, okay, Theophilus. Melissa's actually beat up Theophilus. Well, what are the most popular books that we see in the 2nd and 3rd century of these 60 manuscripts? Well, John is definitely the most popular. Matthew, Luke, the book of Hebrews, Acts, and interestingly enough, Revelation. Well, we have 18 manuscripts of the Gospel of John. Some of them we looked at last week, P52, which is the one in the corner. That's that credit card size document that has a section of John 18. And P66, which we also looked at last week. Well, the second most popular is Matthew, with 12 manuscripts. And I listed there some of the important ones. Well, what about apocryphal manuscripts? What do their numbers look like? Well, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, we only have 17 manuscripts in part or in whole. Now that alone is pretty substantial if we think about the amount of manuscripts in general. Well, the most popular are the Gospel of Thomas, which I talked about before, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter, and a book called the Proto-Evangelion of James. Interestingly enough, the Proto-Evangelion of James is where the Catholics get the idea of the perpetual virginity of Mary. It comes from that book. Well, the most numerous by far is the Gospel of Thomas. Well, how many manuscripts in general, I'm not just talking about the 2nd and 3rd century, the whole kit and caboodle, how many manuscripts do we have of the Gospel of Thomas? You ready for this? 3. Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 1, Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 654, and 655. Now that documentary that I showed at the beginning, if you watch the whole thing, they go on and on about the Gospel of Thomas and how numerous the manuscripts are and how widespread they are. Well, they don't actually tell you how many they are, because that wouldn't look very good for the documentary. And what do we do with this? Well, Larry Hurtado, another New Testament scholar, says the low number of apocryphal manuscripts do not justify any notion that these writings were particularly in favor, and that whatever circles used these writings were likely a clear minority among Christians of the 2nd and 3rd century. Now, we need to ask the question, what was the criteria that the early Christians used to sift through these Gospels? Now, even that notion is sort of anachronistic, because if you were to go back to the 2nd century and ask these Christians, well, why did you choose Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? I think they'd look at you a little bit strangely and say, we didn't choose any of these. They were just the ones that were handed down to us. But if we actually look at the criteria that they were using to sort of sift through them, we have these 3 categories. Now don't worry, I'm going to explain these. Apostolicity, Catholicity, and orthodoxy. Now what does that mean? Well, apostolicity essentially means, does it go back to an apostle or someone who knew an apostle? That was a big flag for outlining whether these books had any credibility. Well, the second one is Catholicity. And I don't want you to get thrown off by the word Catholic. It's actually just a Greek word, katholikos, which is a compound word from the word kata, meaning concerning or about, and holos, meaning the whole. We call that universal. If you've ever read or said the Apostles' Creed, it says, we believe in the Holy Catholic Church. That's a small c Catholic. We're not talking about the Roman Catholic Church in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. They wouldn't have even understood the concept of a Roman Catholic Church. The Romans were persecuting them. But they did talk about the Catholic Church, the universal church. In other words, the second criteria is it accepted by the universal church? If we go to these churches, especially the ones that were founded by apostles, if we go to Antioch and we go to Ephesus, does what they believe reflect the teachings of these books? The third is orthodoxy. Now, like Catholicity, it has nothing to do with the Greek Orthodox Church. It's actually another Greek word. Isn't this fun? Orthodoxia, which is a compound word from orthos, straight or right, and doxa, which among its many meanings means opinion. It's the right opinion. It's the right teaching. Now, the Catholic Church later on, what we know as the Roman Catholic Church, it excommunicated the Orthodox Church, and the Orthodox Church excommunicated, so that the church with the right teaching excommunicated the Universal Church, which gets kind of complicated. So orthodoxy, does it represent the right teaching? AKA, is there known embellishments? Now this is where I want to jump into some of these books in particular. So a specific response, were there any of these books that almost made it? Good question, Jordan. Well, let's look at the contenders. I've outlined 2 contenders. So these are actually the books that almost made it into the New Testament. If any of the apocryphal books were going to make it into the New Testament, it was these. Now, the Shepherd of Hermes and the Epistle of Barnabas, that doesn't sound very controversial. First of all, it's not a gospel. Neither of them are gospels. And second of all, we don't really hear about these. When you watch these documentaries about these quote-unquote lost gospels, they're never going to talk about these because they're not wild-eyed and crazy. In fact, the Muratorian fragment, which I showed you earlier, says this about the Shepherd of Hermes. But Hermes wrote the shepherd very recently in our times, in the city of Rome, while Bishop Pius, his brother, was occupying the chair of the church in the city of Rome. In other words, this book didn't make it into the canon because it failed the first level of apostolicity. We can't trace it back to an apostle. In fact, we know the guy who wrote it. So it's not really scripture. The Shepherd of Hermes actually was an apocalypse. It was like the book of Revelation, similar in a way. Well, the second book, the Epistle of Barnabas. Well, the Epistle of Barnabas is this interesting epistle, and we have this sort of back and forth. Eusebius says that Clement might have thought that Barnabas, the letter was named after the Barnabas, the companion of Paul in Acts. Well, that's sort of a friend of mine told me situation. And the early church recognized this, and they went, we can't really trace this back to an apostle because it's not actually a reliable chain. So it too failed the first criteria, apostolicity. Interestingly enough, it passed Catholicity and Orthodoxy. It was almost widely accepted as a teaching tool, these 2 books, the Shepherd and Barnabas. Now, not the Gospel of Barnabas. There is a Gospel of Barnabas that has nothing to do with this. It was written a long time after this. It is definitely, it's a forgery. But these 2 books, they were universally accepted as good literature, and they didn't teach anything crazy. But they failed the first criteria, apostolicity. Well, the contender number 3, the Gospel of Thomas, we touched on this a little bit. Now, interestingly enough, the Gospel of Thomas, it's not a narrative like we see in the biblical Gospels. It doesn't have a birth, life, death, resurrection of Jesus. It's just a list of 114 sayings. Peter said this, Jesus said this, Thomas said this, Jesus said this, and so on. It also has this Gnostic flavor to it. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, Gnosticism, I'm not going to go too far into this, but Gnosticism was this 2nd century idea that started to crop up. You might have heard the idea of Gnosticism. Well, in biblical Christianity, salvation is something that is done for us, external to us, based on the finished work of Christ. Well, according to Gnosticism, salvation was not something outside of you. It was actually something inside of you. It was very close to modern esoteric mysticism. it's not that Jesus is simply divine, but you're divine. And you have the spark of divinity in you, and you need to unlock this divinity through secret knowledge. Gnosis actually is just the Greek word for knowledge, and this is what the Gnostics believed. However, this was a 2nd century idea, so whenever we see Gnostic ideas, we know that they pop up close to 100 years after the time of Jesus. So anything that's Gnostic is automatically canceled out. Well, I just share a little bit of a story. The expert on the Gospel of Thomas is a woman named Elaine Pagel. She teaches at Princeton Theological Seminary. And she does a lot of talks, and she was doing a talk. It was actually at a liberal church in North Carolina. And unbeknownst to her, there was another scholar in the crowd, in the audience, a man named Michael J. Kruger, who's now he's the president of Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so he's sitting in the audience, he's listening, and he's got a class with him of 20 or 30 students. And after the presentation, during the Q&A, he's feeding his students questions to go up and ask. Well, the presentation's done. The first student who goes up, he doesn't really know what he's saying. He's almost just reading it. He goes up and he says, thank you, Dr. Pagels, for coming and talking with us. I just wanted to know what your interpretation of the last verse of the Gospel of Thomas was, the Logion 1:14. Well, immediately, Elaine Pagels' demeanor changes. She goes very serious, and in order to expand, she quotes Logion 1:14, which says this: Simon Peter said to him, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit, resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Well, that didn't really fit with Dr. Pagels' sort of idea that the Gospel of Thomas was this great, almost feminist gospel, and it promoted this esoteric idea of salvation within us. And in response, she basically said, well, I don't think that's original. Stunned Michael J. Kruger, because there's absolutely no evidence of the 3 copies, 1 full and 2 fragmentary, that we have of the Gospel of Thomas. They all have this. There's no evidence to say that it wasn't there. Well, this, first of all, it fails apostolicity because it's Gnostic. It's a 2nd century document. It fails Catholicity. It was not accepted by the wide range of universal church. In fact, every time we see it quoted by the early church fathers, some of those leaders in the early church period, it's condemned outright. And orthodoxy, well, we've already flown way off the rails with this stuff. So it fails. It fails all 3 criteria. Well, the second contender that I want to talk about is the Gospel of Peter. Now, the Gospel of Peter is a narrative. It's what's called a resurrection narrative. So a lot of this literature was written by groups who wanted to expand upon the biblical text itself. So we have a lot of resurrection narratives. We have a lot of infancy narratives, because the Bible doesn't tell us what the resurrection looked like and what Jesus was like as a child. We have one story in the Gospel of Luke about where Jesus, around the age of 12, goes to the temple, but we really don't have anything else that expands upon that. So we have all of these infancy Gospels. Just quickly, the Arab infancy Gospel of Thomas, not the Gospel of Thomas, but the Arab infancy Gospel of Thomas, has stories where Jesus is bumping into kids and they're falling dead, and then he has to raise them back to life. Everybody's running scared of baby Jesus because he's doing all these crazy things, and he makes birds of clay on the Sabbath, and the Jewish leaders get mad at him because he's working on the Sabbath, and so he breathes on them, they turn into real birds, and they fly away, no evidence. Well, that story actually made its way into the Quran, which is a whole different talk. So the Gospel of Peter is one of these stories. It's a resurrection narrative. It's a 4th century story, and it's a Docetist gospel. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me tell you a little story from the Gospel of Peter. So the Gospel of Peter, in the resurrection narrative, it sort of has the camera rolling on the resurrection itself. And so you have all of the Jewish leaders and all the Roman leaders sleeping outside the tomb. And what happens is that the tomb bursts open, and Jesus comes out, and he's a 90-foot tall Jesus, and his head is in the clouds. And and there are angels flanking him on either side. And then it gets really weird, and the cross comes out of the tomb, and it's talking, it's prophesying. Well, nobody told me how the cross got in the tomb, but it's floating outside of the tomb. And this is very important because they were docetics. Now, dokein in Greek means to see. And the docetists they believed that Jesus was so divine that he wasn't actually physical. In fact, they were what's called dualists. They believed that the physical is bad and the spiritual is good, and that if Jesus was God, couldn't have had a physical body because the physical is bad. So they have stories like, that silly poem where you're walking along the beach and there's only one set of footprints, and Jesus goes, oh, it's because I was carrying you. Well, they have a similar story where Peter and Jesus are walking along the beach, and Peter looks down and there's only one set of footprints, but it's not because Jesus was carrying him. It's because Jesus doesn't actually exist. He's just sort of a floating spirit right beside him. So they have this docetic sort of idea. And in fact, Jesus on the cross is totally complacent. He doesn't feel any pain. He's not actually there. So he's sort of hanging there, and then they put him in the tomb, and he floats out, and he's 90 feet tall. So it fails. It fails because, first of all, it's a 4th century document. It doesn't fit the script for going back to either an apostle or someone who knew an apostle. It fails because it wasn't accepted by the universal church, that Catholicity. And it fails orthodoxy because it has all these crazy docetic heresies. Well, what were the only books that had any credibility? Good question, Paul. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, if you forget everything I said tonight, and all you remember is that the only Gospels that come from the 1st century are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that'll be good. I'd like you not to forget everything I said. But that'll get you far. If you encounter people who are objecting to the books in the Bible and bringing up all these other Gospels, which did exist and were used, all you can say is, well, the only ones that come from the time of Jesus are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All the others are later, all of them. So did these contenders have a chance at making it? Once again, good question, Jordan. No. They didn't. None of them did. In fact, the concept of a lost gospel is sort of a misnomer. They weren't as much lost. We've always known about them. Now, we found more copies of them. But they weren't really lost, and they weren't really secret, unless you count the Gnostic Gospels, which try to present some secret knowledge. So, coming full circle, how do we deal with the clip from the beginning? How do we deal with that accusation that there were all these books? Well, the question shouldn't be whether there were books. The question should be, what are the only books that give us an accurate portrayal and presentation of the historical Jesus? Because that's what I want to know. It's sort of the same question and answer as we dealt with last week. I don't want to know what a scribe in the 4th century wrote at John 5:4. I want to know what John wrote about Jesus. In the same way, I don't want to know what some guy in the 4th century wrote about floating Jesus. I want to know about the historical Jesus who lived and died for my sins. And what are the only books that do that? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's it. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you that we can have trust in your word, Lord, in the ancient words that you've passed down to us. We thank you that you've given us confidence in the ways in which we can evaluate our faith, that we can test these things if we have doubt, that biblical faith, true faith, is not blind, but that is informed. Lord, likewise, we thank you for these portrayals of Jesus. Lord, the stories that you have given us that do tell us about your Son, Jesus Christ, and what he did for us. Lord, we thank you that we live in a country where we can talk about these things openly. For we know there are many places around the world where that's not possible. Lord, once again, I just thank you for the opportunity to come, to worship, and to learn. Lord, I pray that as we go forward, your word would be our rule, your spirit our teacher, and your greater glory our supreme concern. Amen.
Awesome. Can we thank Wes for being with us?